Again from Mark chapter 4, and I'll begin reading at verse 13 this morning. Then Jesus said to them, "Don't you understand this parable? How then will you understand any parable? The farmer sows the word, and some people are like seed along the path where the word is sown. As soon as they hear it, Satan comes and takes away the word that was sown in them. Others, like seed sowed on rocky places, hear the word and at once receive it with joy. But since they have no root, they last only a short time. When trouble or persecution comes because of the word, they quickly fall away." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. The soil that Jesus is describing here is the sort that has just enough good dirt to get something started, but not enough dirt to be able to sustain that growth when the hard times come. And the problem this time is rocks. There are rocks that are mixed in with the soil, and they give the field the appearance of being able to produce fruit, but the soil is just so thin, and that though the seed gets a start, at the first sign of any sort of trouble and hardship, it withers and dies. In certain places, rocks are a natural part of farming, and picking rocks is as important as planting seed or fertilizing the ground. Each winter, the frost pushes up more rocks from deep in the earth, and those rocks have to be removed. And so the question I think we want to ask this morning is, what are the rocks in our lives that Jesus is referring to, and what does it mean to have them removed? Jesus tells us that when trouble or persecution comes about because of the word, we become aware of the damage that the rocks have done. We become aware that the roots have not been able to take place. These are those moments when our faith, when walking in God's way, becomes difficult, and so we choose not to. These are those moments when faithfulness to God means us having to suffer or to change, and we'd rather not. These are the moments when the seed dies, because it doesn't have the deep roots that are capable of sustaining us, the word, in hard times. You see, the rocks that were not removed have prevented the roots from growing. As I've been meditating on this entire parable over the last month or so, there is a phrase that has continually, every week in preparation, this one phrase keeps coming up in my mind over and over again. And literally every week I write it down in my sermon notes, and I think this is the week that I need to share this word, because it obviously is something that God is telling me and wants me to tell you. And I've written it down each time thinking that I would include it, but then I delete it because, well, to be honest, I don't like this word. I don't like this phrase. I don't like what it says to me, and I fear you won't like it either. I delete it because I don't like it. It first came into my mind, got written down on the page when thinking about why Jesus taught in parables. The whole concept that he did so to make it harder to understand and not easier. It came up again when thinking about that hard-packed path, knowing that tilling up the soil of old fears and wounds and bitterness is painful, hard work. It came up again just this week, thinking about how hard it is to remove rocks in a field, how much easier it is to just let them be, to choose not to deal with them, to choose not even to look at them or to see them. This phrase that keeps coming up, that I keep writing down but keep erasing because I don't want to have to say it, because I don't want to have to live it, because I don't want to have to share it. It comes from having grown up on a farm, on knowing that farming is hard work. It comes from knowing that in farming, if it isn't hard, you're not doing it right. In some ways, it is the same curse that we are all under, a curse that goes all the way back to almost the beginning. It comes after Adam and Eve have chosen to go their own way instead of God's way. In Genesis 3, verse 17, we read these words, "Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil, You will eat food from it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow, you will eat the food until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken. For dust you are, and to dust you will return. You see, in farming, rocks have to be either removed or ground down into the dust, into the soil, to become and to be made into good dirt. And either way, whether the rocks are removed or ground down, it is hard and painful and uncomfortable, but necessary if the field is going to produce good fruit. So this is the phrase that keeps coming back. Life is hard. And if it isn't, you're not doing it right. Being a Christian is hard. And if it isn't, you're not doing it right. I want you to sit with that for a minute this morning. I want you to think about your life, about our church, about our nation, about our world, about the ways that we think of ourselves as Christian, as faithful, as obedient, and about the possibility of the ways that we are not, about the rocks that exist in our lives, in our families, in our church, in our nation, in our world. We are living in a time of great turbulence and upheaval. And during these times, the rocks, they're more easily seen than in others. Waters of storms have washed away much of the soil, and we see lots of rocks. In this past week, if you've been following the news, you have continued to see the rocks of injustice, the rocks of racism, the rocks of inequality. You've seen the rocks of sin in our relationships with the people that we might be packed into with. Maybe there's been some rocky moments, some rocky conversations, some rocky times. Maybe as things have been stripped bare, we are discovering that the places we turn to for comfort. Okay, so I had to edit the video there because quite literally at that moment while I was trying to record this message, one of my sons opened the door and walked by on his way to the outside, and I yelled at him for it. And then I had to go back and rewind the video to figure out where it was that I was getting interrupted so that I could go back to preaching about how we all need to be aware of the rocky places in our lives and recognize that I had just yelled at my son for doing nothing other than walking through a room that normally there would be no reason why he shouldn't walk through. I didn't warn him. Thanks God. Sometimes the most important lessons we need to learn are lessons that come when things get exposed that we didn't see before. There's an opportunity right now for us to see some stuff that has been wrong with our world, with our nation, maybe with our church, certainly within our own lives. Maybe now some things are coming to the surface that have been buried there for eons. And maybe now it's time to do something about it. I want to end this morning with a story from Paul Harvey. Some of you may remember him. He's a radio host who had a famous show called The Rest of the Story. And this is a story about some things that happen sometimes in the midst of storms, in the midst of change. It doesn't necessarily deal with rocks, but it does deal with maybe being open to what God is doing and where God is leading. So listen. There was just one problem with Swan Quarter, North Carolina. It was a lowland, so naturally the choicest real estate was on the highest ground. In the event of a heavy rain, the closer you were to sea level, the harder you were hit. A little more than 100 years ago, the Methodists of Swan Quarter had no church, and the only lot available on which to build one was a plow of low-lying property on Oyster Creek Road. It was far from an ideal location, but they'd acquired the land and construction began. The church was to be white frame, small but sturdy, propped up on brick pilings. In 1876, the building was completed, and on Sunday, September 16, a joyous dedication ceremony was celebrated. That was Sunday, September 16. 3 days later, on Wednesday, a terrible storm lashed Swan Quarter. All day the wind howled and the rain came down in a gray wall of water. By nightfall, devastation. Much of the town was flooded. Many roofs were ripped from homes by the cyclonic turbulence. The storm raged on all through the night and into the bleak morning. By Thursday afternoon, the wind subsided. The rain had all but stopped. And for the first time in more than a day, there was an almost eerie calm. One by one, the citizens of Swan Quarter threw back the shutters and peered from what was left of their homes. Most saw only a desolate waterscape, a community ravaged by nature. But those within sight of Oyster Creek Road beheld the most incredible sight they had ever seen. The church, the Swan Quarter Methodist Church, the whole building, intact, was floating down the street. The floodwaters had gently lifted the entire structure from the brick pilings on which it had rested and had sent it off slowly, silently down Oyster Creek Road. Within minutes, several concerned townfolk were sloshing about in the street, waist deep, fighting the rushing current, trying desperately to reach the still-moving church so that they could moor it with links of rope. The ropes were fashioned, but the effort was in vain. There was no stable structure secure enough to restrain the floating chapel. And as the building passed by, more attention attracted, more aid was enlisted, but it was to no avail. The church moved on. By now, the building had made it to the center of town, still on Oyster Creek Road. And then, as dozens of amazed, helpless people watched, the Swan Quarter Methodist Church, still floating, made a sharp, inexplicable right turn and continued down that road as though the chapel were alive, as though it had a mind of its own. For 2 more blocks, the townspeople fought the ropes to hold it back unsuccessfully. And then, in the same decisive manner with which it had moved, the church veered off the road, headed for the center of a vacant lot. And there it stopped. While the floodwater receded, the church remained. And there it is to this day. Over 100 Septembers have passed since the little white frame church removed itself to the most desirable property in Swan Quarter. In the process of making up your own mind as to how and why, what happened, you ought to know this one more thing, which is the rest of the story. The choice Highland lot where the chapel settled after the flood was the first choice of the town Methodists for the site for their church. However, the person who owned that land was a shrewd and prosperous landowner who refused to sell it to them. But the morning after the flood, after discovering the church in the middle of his lot, that same landowner went to the Methodist minister and with trembling hands presented him with the deed. And now you know the rest of the story. Sometimes, in the midst of storms, God can do amazing things.
Let your kingdom come and grow. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us, we cry. Will you rise? Will you rise? Rise up, rise up. The earth will fear the Lord when you avenge the poor and bear your holy arm to keep them safe from harm. May your kingdom come. Oh, rise up. Oh, rise up.
May the Lord bless you and keep you and cause his face to shine upon you. May he turn his face towards you and give you his peace. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.